You're standing in the hills outside ancient Sparta, watching as a newborn baby is carried away from its mother's arms by stern-faced elders. The infant's cries echo through the mountain air as these men examine every inch of the child's body, searching for any sign of weakness or deformity. What happens next will determine whether this baby lives or dies, whether it becomes a legendary warrior or disappears forever into the unforgiving wilderness. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood movie-aggrated myth or some X. This was reality for every single child born in ancient Sparta, the most militaristic society the world has ever known. What you're about to discover will fundamentally challenge everything you thought you knew about childhood, parenting, and human survival. Before we dive into these shocking revelations about Spartan child-rearing practices, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of ancient civilizations, consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. I'd love to know where you're watching from in the comments below. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about one brutal society from 2,500 years ago. It's about the most extreme experiment in human conditioning ever attempted, where children weren't raised by their parents but forged like weapons in the fires of systematic cruelty. Every practice, every tradition, every seemingly impossible demand placed on Spartan children served one terrifying purpose: to create the most effective killing machines the ancient world had ever seen. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. It actually worked. For over 3 dominant centuries, Sparta the ancient world not through superior numbers or advanced technology, but through the systematic destruction and reconstruction of childhood itself. They discovered something that modern child psychologists are only beginning to understand: that human beings can be programmed from birth to endure unimaginable hardship and perform superhuman feats, but only at a cost that would horrify any parent today. What I'm going to reveal in this video will show you exactly how the Spartans transformed innocent babies into legendary warriors through practices so extreme that they were considered shocking even by their own brutal contemporaries. We'll explore the selection process that determined which children lived and which died, the training methods that broke down every natural human instinct, and the psychological techniques that created soldiers who literally preferred death to defeat. But most importantly, we'll uncover the hidden human cost of this system, the individual stories of suffering and survival that ancient historians tried to bury, and the long-term consequences that ultimately destroyed Spartan society from within. Because while the Spartans succeeded in creating the most feared military force of the ancient world, they also created something else: a civilization so obsessed with strength that it forgot how to be human. The first shock begins before these children could even open their eyes. Unlike every other society in ancient Greece, Spartan babies weren't welcomed into the world by their mother's loving embrace or their father's proud celebration. Instead, within hours of birth, every newborn was taken from the family home and brought before a council of elderly warriors known as the Gerousia. These weren't kindly grandfathers examining a precious new addition to the family. These were battle-scarred veterans whose job was to determine whether each baby possessed the physical perfection necessary to serve the Spartan state. The examination was thorough, clinical, and utterly merciless. Every limb was tested for strength and flexibility. Every feature was scrutinized for signs of deformity or weakness. The baby's cry was analyzed for lung capacity and vocal strength. But here's what makes this process so much more disturbing than you might imagine. The Spartans weren't just looking for obvious disabilities or birth defects. They were searching for any indication that this child might not develop into a perfect warrior. A slightly weak grip, an asymmetrical face, even unusual birthmarks could seal a baby's fate. The standards were so impossibly high that historians estimate up to 60% of Spartan newborns failed this initial inspection. And what happened to those who failed? This is where the Spartan system reveals its true horror. These rejected infants weren't given to other families or sent away to live different lives. They were carried to a place called the Apothetai, a chasm in the Tacitus Mountains where they were left to die of exposure. The reasoning was coldly practical. Sparta couldn't afford to waste resources on citizens who wouldn't contribute to military strength. Imagine being a Spartan mother holding your newborn child for what might be the last time, knowing that strangers would soon decide whether your baby deserved to live. Imagine the agony of waiting for the elder's verdict, understanding that your maternal instincts, your love, your dreams for this child meant absolutely nothing compared to the state's assessment of military potential. But even the babies who passed this initial test weren't safe. The Spartans had discovered something that modern parents would find unthinkable: that human infants are far more resilient than we believe, but only if you systematically remove every comfort and protection we consider essential for healthy development. Spartan babies who survived the selection process were immediately subjected to what can only be described as deliberate trauma designed to toughen them for the hardships ahead. They were bathed in wine instead of warm water, the alcohol serving both as a disinfectant and an early test of physical resilience. Weak babies would react poorly to this harsh treatment, providing another opportunity for elimination. The infant's diet was carefully controlled to prevent what the Spartans saw as softness. Unlike other Greek babies who were breastfed on demand and comforted when they cried, Spartan infants were fed on rigid schedules designed to teach them that their needs were secondary to discipline. They were deliberately kept slightly hungry, the theory being that well-fed babies became weak and dependent. Most shocking of all, Spartan babies were never allowed to cry without consequences. When they wept from hunger, cold, or discomfort, they weren't comforted or soothed. Instead, they were left alone until they learned to endure suffering in silence. The Spartans believed that crying was the first sign of weakness, and they were determined to eliminate this natural human response before it could take root. Modern child development experts would recognize these practices as systematic psychological abuse designed to disrupt normal bonding patterns and create what we now call attachment disorders. But the Spartans saw it as essential preparation for a life where emotional vulnerability could mean death on the battlefield. The sleeping arrangements for Spartan infants reveal another layer of calculated cruelty. While other Greek babies slept in warm, soft beds surrounded by loving family members, Spartan infants were placed in hard, cold cradles designed to promote physical toughness. They were deliberately exposed to temperature extremes, the reasoning being that comfort in infancy led to weakness in adulthood. Perhaps most disturbing was the Spartan practice of exposing babies to controlled doses of fear and pain. Loud noises, sudden movements, and minor physical discomforts were introduced systematically to desensitize these children to shock and trauma. The goal was to create babies who wouldn't startle at the sound of clashing weapons or cry when experiencing physical hardship. By the time these infants reached their first birthday, they had already undergone conditioning that would be considered torture by modern standards. They had learned to suppress their natural responses to hunger, cold, fear, and pain. They had been trained to expect no comfort, no unconditional love, no protection from the harsh realities of existence. But this was only the beginning. What awaited these children as they grew older would make their infant experiences seem gentle by comparison. The Spartans had spent centuries perfecting a system of childhood conditioning so extreme that it transformed human nature itself, creating warriors who were simultaneously superhuman in their capabilities and tragically broken in their humanity. The true horror wasn't just what they did to these children, but how systematically they destroyed everything we consider essential for healthy human development. And yet, somehow, this brutal system created the most effective military force the ancient world had ever seen, raising questions about human nature that we're still trying to answer today. The transformation from broken infant to warrior began at age 7, when every Spartan child faced what can only be described as state-sanctioned kidnapping. On a predetermined day, armed soldiers would arrive at family homes to collect boys for the agag, the brutal military training system that would consume the next 13 years of their lives. The scene was deliberately traumatic. Children were torn from their mother's arms while being told this separation was an honor, a necessary step toward becoming true Spartans. But here's what makes this even more psychologically devastating. The boys weren't just taken away, they were forbidden from showing any emotion about leaving their families. Crying, clinging to parents, or expressing fear were punishable offenses that marked a child as weak before training even began. Imagine 7-year-old boys, already conditioned to suppress natural human responses, now forced to walk away from everything they'd ever known without displaying the terror they undoubtedly felt. The barracks where these children were housed weren't military academies in any sense we'd recognize today. They were deliberate hellscapes designed to strip away every comfort, every individual identity, every connection to normal human experience. Boys were grouped into units called islas. Sleeping on beds made of reeds, they had to gather themselves from riverbanks using only their bare hands. The sharp edges would cut their skin, but complaining about discomfort meant additional punishment. Food became the first weapon used against these children. Spartan boys were kept in a state of constant near starvation, receiving just enough nutrition but never enough to feel to survive satisfied. This wasn't an oversight or economic necessity, it was calculated policy. Hungry children were easier to control, more focused on immediate survival than rebellion, and forced to develop the cunning and ruthlessness that would serve them in warfare. But the Spartans took this hunger strategy to truly disturbing extremes. Boys were actively encouraged to steal food, not as a moral failing, but as a military skill. They were taught to lie, deceive, and take whatever they needed to survive. However, getting caught stealing resulted in savage beatings, not for the theft itself, but for being clumsy enough to get discovered. This created a psychological nightmare where children had to become criminals to avoid starvation, then perfect those criminal skills to avoid punishment. The most infamous example of this twisted logic was the story of the boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When questioned by his instructors, he maintained his innocence even as the terrified animal clawed through his stomach, literally disemboweling him from the inside. He died rather than admit to the theft, and this became a celebrated example of Spartan courage. Modern psychologists would recognize this as the behavior of a child so thoroughly traumatized that death seemed preferable to disappointing authority figures. Physical conditioning began immediately and escalated to levels that would horrify modern parents. 7-year-old boys were forced to exercise naked in all weather conditions, running barefoot across rocky terrain until their feet became so calloused they resembled leather. They learned to sleep outdoors without blankets, to march for hours without water, to ignore injuries that would send modern children to emergency rooms. The training methods were designed not just to build physical strength, but to systematically destroy normal pain responses. Boys were beaten regularly, not as punishment for specific infractions, but as routine conditioning to help them endure torture if captured by enemies. They learned to remain silent during these beatings, understanding that any cry or plea for mercy would result in even more severe treatment. Perhaps most disturbing was how the Spartans used shame and peer pressure to enforce compliance. Boys who showed weakness weren't just punished by instructors, they were ostracized by their fellow trainees, who understood that association with failure could bring collective punishment. This created an environment where children policed each other's behavior with a cruelty that adults might have found excessive. The psychological manipulation reached its peak during ritual ceremonies designed to test courage and pain tolerance. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, teenage boys were flogged until they bled, sometimes to death, while their families watched from the sidelines. Parents were expected to encourage their sons to endure more punishment, and boys who collapsed or cried out brought shame not just on themselves, but on their entire bloodline. These weren't occasional tests of courage, but annual events that became public spectacles, with crowds gathering to watch children suffer for entertainment. The boys who endured the longest floggings without showing weakness were celebrated as heroes, while those who failed were marked for life as inferior specimens unworthy of full Spartan citizenship. But the agage wasn't just about physical conditioning and pain tolerance. The Spartans understood that creating effective killers required destroying natural human empathy and moral reasoning. Boys were forced to participate in activities that would traumatize normal children, hunting and killing helots for sport, participating in raids against neighboring communities, watching executions and torture sessions as educational entertainment. They were taught that mercy was weakness, that compassion was dangerous softness that could get them killed in battle. The ability to inflict suffering without emotional response became a valued skill, practiced and refined through exercises that modern societies would classify as war crimes. These children learned to see other human beings not as individuals deserving of basic dignity, but as obstacles to be eliminated or tools to be exploited. The Spartans had discovered something that child psychologists are only now beginning to understand, that human empathy isn't innate but learned, and it can be systematically unlearned through repeated exposure to violence and suffering. They created children who could kill without hesitation, torture without guilt, and watch others suffer without feeling the natural human impulse to help. This systematic destruction of normal moral development had consequences that extended far beyond military effectiveness. Spartan society became incapable of the cooperation and innovation that other Greek city-states used to advance their civilizations. They couldn't adapt to changing circumstances because their entire worldview was built on the assumption that strength through suffering was the only path to success. The boys who survived this conditioning emerged as teenagers who were no longer recognizably human in the way we understand the term. They had been transformed into something else entirely, living weapons programmed for a single purpose, incapable of the emotional connections and moral reasoning that define healthy human relationships. But this transformation came at a price that would ultimately destroy the very society that created them. The Spartan experiment in human conditioning stands as one of history's most successful failures. They achieved their goal of creating unbeatable warriors, but in doing so, they destroyed the very humanity that gives civilization meaning. These weren't just brutal practices from a distant past, they represent the logical endpoint of prioritizing strength over compassion, conformity over individuality, state power over human dignity. As we've seen, the Spartans discovered that human nature is far more malleable than we might want to believe. They proved that children can be systematically conditioned to endure unimaginable suffering and suppress every natural instinct for survival and connection. But they also proved that such conditioning comes with a devastating cost, the loss of everything that makes us truly human. Today, as we watch our own children struggle with anxiety, depression, and social pressures, perhaps we can learn something from Sparta's ultimate fate. Their obsession with creating perfect warriors left them incapable of adapting to a changing world. They became so focused on strength that they forgot wisdom, so devoted to uniformity that they lost the creativity needed to survive. The babies carried away from their mother's arms in ancient Sparta remind us that childhood isn't just preparation for adulthood, it's the foundation of our humanity itself. The Spartans may have created legendary warriors, but they lost something infinitely more precious, their souls.